Yagbaragada, ayélujára, ọ̀nà ti la àárín odò rèé kọjá, ẹ̀rù òbodò, odò ti ṣàn, ẹ̀kún omi ṣàn títí, ó já sí àárín ọ̀nà. Odò lóhùn lẹ̀gbọ́n, ọ̀nà lóhùn lẹ̀gbọ́n, á ti rìn.
Okay, so welcome to BB2Me Concert again today. We're honored to have Dr. DeReef Jamison here today to talk about honoring the scholarship of Dr. Amos Wilson. I think everybody that's joined us today is very familiar with the works of Dr. Amos Wilson, but I thought it would be a great opportunity to have this discussion with Dr. DeReef Jamison. I actually found a work that you published on the Journal of Pan-African Studies website online, honoring the scholarship, and it looks like it was from a huge conference that happened down in Tallahassee back in 2011. But before I do that, I'll go ahead and read a little bit about Dr. DeReef Jamison. He received his BS in psychology from Bowie State University, his master's in community psychology from Florida Agricultural, FAMU, we call it, and a PhD in African American Studies from Temple University. He's an assistant professor of African American Studies at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. Dr. DeReef Jamison's research interests include Africana and intellectual history and diasporic connections of Africana psychology and the psychology of race and racism. He has published articles and essays in the Journal of African American Studies, Race, Gender, and Class, the DREO, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, the Western Journal of Black Studies, the Journal of Black Psychology, and the Encyclopedia of African Heritage in North America. With that, we are open with a brief statement. I'd like to say that for today's discussion, we would like to honor and pay tribute and respects to the ancestor Amos Wilson for his legacy and his work that he left us with, for the legacy of others such as Dr. Bobby Wright, our recent ancestor, Dr. Francis Cress Wilson, another psychologist, Dr. Franz Fanon, and those in that arena that have sacrificed and put the works together so that we may have this understanding today. So with that, Dr. Jamison, open the floor to you. If you want to speak a little bit about yourself more before we get started.
Oh, no, I think the intro pretty much did a good job of that. I guess I'll do a little background, but first, I just want to thank you for having me and having this opportunity in this space, because most of the people you just talked about are the Black psychologists that we talk about at the conference. And at the conference, part of what we try to do is highlight some of these people who we look at in the African-centered context, but outside of that, in African-American psychology and other circles, they really don't talk about these psychologists. So all those people you named, I'm glad you named those people, because that's who the conference yearly, who the conference honors. So what we did at this conference is that we normally look at a Black psychologist each year. So it started off Florida A&M University, so we began with Colby Cambon, who started the African-centered psychology program at FAMU. The next year we had Amos Wilson, then we did Naeem Akbar, Bobby Wright, Francis Cress Wilson. So all those people, each year we honor a Black psychologist. So I appreciate you for having this space in this forum to talk about those.
Absolutely. So Dr. Jamison, real quick, and it's my bad, I want to bring Dr. Cambon back on so he can actually do the libation statement himself. So I'm going to unmute Dr. Cambon. Dr. Cambon, if you want to unmute yourself, you can go ahead and start the libation.
Otumfo aradi nyoko ponchiro pompami chiro nsune mawansio asati amponya mo asati adi mo sama dere die de mefedie abosun ya somo do so yi mi mo muni ba ko ma so pro pa na yepremi na konkontano brepatano sitana sigibe si wonsa ben kumni akoni di wonsa ben kumni asubo fo so jo fomina estre etikena fo akena toye asi abena kumina mumra yete eti tere ya bibia ya ko so to se yese ene da ben ene ya podiata ebia Wesomo mfano kwa sanyi termonyasa enenso yebe kai yenana Amos Wilson ene omo enimono tere ya yebe sima kai omo ene omo edumapa omo yema abifa ho de ene abifo ene abima we na etromi na dia ompati nyo koso ne de obone bratra ma yeye yete obia nhia tampo ndinyo so yeshira ya tampo mon domino Moma na Sapona, Shin and Kaba, Samoy. Monsignor, yes, Yahai, Monsignor Okunini, DeReef, Jamison, instead of Baya, Nano ever Fonati, Eboko Wano, when I is from me, and you know, yes, Yanyan, Baya, Yabaya Kanko, any abuse for what they are, my any abuse for you now. When I is from Modaurama, Monsignor in Cositos.
Yeah.
So we always like to do that, Dr. Jamison, to really bring in the essence of what we're really trying to do here is you know, the libation statement is when we connect ourselves with our ancestors, and we actually have them to come in and provide us with that wisdom and that understanding to speak the words of wisdom. So I'm sorry for that interruption, but so go ahead and continue, Dr. Jamison. So yeah, so the intro and the bio and a little bit about yourself, a little bit more.
Okay.
And about the conference itself, you were talking about some of the other scholars that were there and some of the other ones you honored.
Yeah, so we honor a different scholar each year. So next year, well, this year we'll do Baba Asa Hilliard. We'll do Baba Asa Hilliard, and we send out, you know, call for papers, and different people come in and present on these different scholars. So that's pretty much how the conference works. And what we did with Amos Wilson is that we took different papers from people who presented and put those together to do the special issue for the Journal of Black Psychology. So some were scholarly papers, others were actual workshops, because as we'll talk about today, we can't really talk about Amos Wilson without talking about, you know, some type of action, putting something into practice. So some of them were different workshops where they were interactive, but we tried to take those scholarly pieces and pieces that we could and put these in there to honor him. And I appreciate the libation, because we, like at FAMU, we always try to bring the ancestors into the space. And even though it's academic and it's ideas, it's still like this idea, like we said in the introduction, this intellectual libation. You know, so like spiritual libation, then also like the ideas, like the intellectual libation to bring it into the space as well. So I definitely appreciate that. And so before we get started into a general overview of Amos Wilson, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, I think I do want to talk about how I got to this point.
Sure.
So I started off, I guess like you, Kevin, I wanted to be in communications. And eventually I saw myself having like this radio show where we talk about all these conscious and social political issues. But then I thought that doesn't always work. Like you can't always get in. That's before the internet. And I didn't see how I would be in that position. So one day I was in the library and I ran across Introduction to Black Studies. And I flipped to that chapter where it had Black psychology. And that just blew my mind. I saw Naim Akbar. I saw Joseph Baldwin / Kobe Cambon. So Wade Nobles. Franz Cress Welsing. I don't think he had Amos in there at that point. But when I saw that chapter and they began to talk about this idea of this consciousness and how our ideas influence our behavior, and this idea of psychology, of oppression and liberation, that's what made me switch into psychology.
Sure.
So at Bowie State, I'm in psychology, and I would just immediately go to like the Journal of Black Psychology. Anytime I had a chance to go to the library, I would just go there. And I started in 1974, the first journal. I just kept reading through, and I was just amazed at all the people and the ideas that they were talking about. So that's when I knew that I wanted to go to Florida A&M so I could further my study, particularly in African-centered psychology.
Sure.
And for my PhD, I didn't want to do psychology proper, but I still wanted to deal with the psychology and liberation. So at Temple, that's where I combined the Black psychology with African-American studies, and that's how I ended up studying the people I study now. And again, the reason why I appreciate the opportunity is that part of what my work does is I try to look at the intellectual history of African psychology. And in that intellectual history, it gets marginalized within the larger discipline of African American studies. So within our cipher and in our circle, we talk about these people a lot. But in the larger discipline of African American studies, they really don't deal with these thinkers and these ideas. So part of what my work is to do is I try to expose and talk about those people, and then also tie it in to the African American studies discipline.
Sure, sure. Now, in terms of your journal submission, and thank you for that, by the way. In terms of your journal submission itself, when I first ran across it on the journal on the website, it really intrigued me as well. And looking into the actual body of your work that you submitted, and there's actually another doctor that was a co-contributor, Dr. Huberta Jackson Lohman, PhD from Florida A&M, was another contributor. But I looked at it, and it's broken down of your review of this conference, and it goes section by section. And what I wanted to do is kind of go through each section and let you speak a little bit about that section in particular, the research that went into it, and what you reviewed, and what made you write that particular session as you contributed to this paper.
Okay.
The first section itself is the liberatory aspects of an African-centered consciousness, and I think what I want to ask you to do is kind of explain that title, and if you could, from your perspective, and then go a little bit about that particular subject as you reviewed in your paper.
Okay, so with the liberatory aspects, part of what a lot of times we talk about African-centered psychology, and we talk about liberation psychology, but there's like this gap between the theory and the practice. And actually at times I can be, somewhat guilty of that myself, in that dealing with the theory and not actually looking at the actual practice of it. And that's been a critique a lot of people have of the African-centered psychological movement. So what we wanted to do in that area was look at what are these aspects of liberation that people not only talk about, but how do they implement it? And when you look at Amos Wilson's work, that's what separates him from a lot of other black psychologists, is that, number one, his clarity. And that when you look at Amos Wilson in undergrad, my best friend and I, we gave him the name ID Psi. And the reason we gave him ID Psi, he who speaks clear or makes his point clear. And when you look at Amos Wilson's work, I mean, he's so clear. So we wanted to look at that. But also, if you look at his work, he talks about critical consciousness, this idea of recognizing some of the contradictions in society. But then also, once you are aware and recognize those, how do you take action to alleviate and to find solutions to those issues? So that's part of this critical consciousness. So that's what we wanted to look at in the liberation section. And then also, what I like about Amos Wilson, we wanted to look there too, is that he also has a critique of even us, a critique of African-centered psychology, and some things that we should be wary of as we talk and as we go through some of the work that we do. So in that section, we wanted to put together the work that kind of spoke to what are these liberation aspects that move us from theory into practice, or to combine those together to what they try to call practice. So in that, that's what we wanted to look at there.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that even myself, as we all evolve in our studies, and we kind of one of the things that for me, Dr. Amos Wilson does is really make you look internally at ourselves. A lot of times we get caught up in studying others, studying how they are, and we get lost in really knowing who we are in that space. And one of the things, Dr. Amos Wilson, he always says is, that's that alien inside of you. And even though you get attacked, you start protecting that alien. So yeah, definitely for Dr. Amos Wilson, that critical critique of ourselves, more so than studying others, for me is what Dr. Amos Wilson really, really impacts me on. So yeah.
And I like how, and Tim, real quick, if I can interject, I like how you brought that up. Because part of also what he talked about, so in the first section of the paper, in my paper, I talked about education. And if you look at Amos Wilson's work, particularly in falsification, when he talked about education, he was saying if you want to know the psychology of a people, you study their history. He talked about Eurocentric history, psychiatry, and the politics of white supremacy. Part of what he's saying, if you want to study people's psychology, then study their history. So we don't know our history, of course, we don't know our psychology. But then he flips it as well and kind of builds on what Dr. Clark talked about. He says, if you want to know the psychology, study your oppressor. So this idea of we can study ourselves as well as study the European. But in studying the European, you're studying the psychology of the oppressor so you can get rid of that alien spirit that you were talking about. But he does give like a precursor in that he's saying that, you have to approach that with an African-centered orientation. But this whole notion of that we study ourselves and study our oppressor so we can understand the psychology of both.
Definitely. He talks, Dr. Amos Wilson always says, look at the constants. If I can hear his lectures right now in my head, it's the one thing I hear constantly repeated in his lectures is study the constants. The constants are what you need to focus on in order to really understand, your position with the we call them Eurasians. Study the constants. So, yeah, thank you for that interjection. So the next section of the paper goes into, which is very intriguing to me. It goes into the remixing the blueprint for Black Power. Now the blueprint, this book is a must-have for everybody. I'm going to go ahead and say. But you put the remixing of the blueprint for Black Power. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Okay, yeah. So actually, let's do something clear. So in that introduction there, those are the papers that are in the issue, okay. And I wrote like I guess you could say like an introduction to each section that dealt with that paper. But the reason I call that section remixing is that if you look at the work of Cato Swan and some of these people, how do you apply Amos Wilson to the larger context of Black Power? So Black Power as far as Pan-Africanism, how is that manifested in the diaspora, in the Caribbean, on the continent, here in the United States? So the remixing was, what Cato did in his paper is that he tried to look at what are some of those contemporary dynamics of Black Power. And part of what Amos Wilson, why we love him so much, is that he said that at the end of the day, we can study like all the origins and all the theories. We can say all that we want to. But at the end of the day, white people in power do the things they do because they can. And when he hits that, y'all, and says that they do the things they do because they can, that leads us straight to power. That leads us straight to like what puts them in the position so they can do. And so that makes us, what do we have to do that we can counter white power without concept of what Black Power means? So in that remixing, that was him trying to put a contemporary swing on Black Power, and how would Amos address that in the 21st century?
You know, every time, each section you speak, and I can hear certain phrases of Dr. Wilson.
Right.
Well, he says, well, you know, in order for the world to be the way it is, we have to be out of our mind. You see what constantly says, we have to be out of our mind. In order to do what they do, we have to be literally out of our minds. You know, we have to be backwards for the world. You know, when the ad that kind of frame. I want to know a little bit more about this section deeper. So, could you expand a little bit more about how you kind of modernize this concept of blueprint for Black Power, if you could? I got a little bit.
So actually, that was like Cato's paper.
Oh, okay.
So I'm not. So since that's Cato's paper, so I'm not as familiar with the nuances of his actual paper. But I know that was like the basis of what he was trying to do. Look at this diasporic manifestation of Black Power, particularly looking at examples in the Caribbean of Black people having revolutions and fighting back against colonialism.
Okay. So it looks like we got to get Dr. Swan on next.
Right.
A little bit. One of the things we put in there is the caveat of obnoxious slave. I think that was Peter Swan as well.
Yeah, that's Peter. Yeah.
So what I want to do is 1:20, a couple more minutes to go, and then I'm pretty sure we have some questions coming from the listeners. But the next section I want to talk about a little bit is the Wilsonian applications, and I think this is where we're going to get a lot more of the interaction and the conversation, because this paints the picture of really, to the core essence, what Dr. Amos Wilson, for me, what stands out about him is that, like you said, from theory to practice. I don't know if you can speak a little bit about some of the things that you learned in your research about Dr. Wilson, some of the things that he actually did in terms of practice beyond the lecture model. But in this section, I want to really let you speak to just the theory to practice about Dr. Amos Wilson.
Okay. Yeah, so there was this scholar named Cam Howard, and Cam Howard is out of Chicago. So what Cam Howard has, he actually has the Amos Wilson Institute in Chicago. Wow. So we had Cam Howard come, and he talked about the Institute, and I can connect you with him as well, but he talked about the Institute, and then he talked about some of the things that they do within the Institute to try to actualize some of these practices of Amos Wilson. So one of the best examples I remember from what he talked about is that in working with children and trying to defeat this idea of the falsification of African consciousness, Amos Wilson talked about we have to look at how we approach time. And how we approach time, of course, our concept of time, as far as history, has to be different from the Europeanization and how their historiography looked at time. So, for example, what Cam did is that how do you actualize, how do you deal with when Hegel talked about let us leave this Africa because it hasn't offered anything to the world. So Africa hasn't contributed anything to humanity. And how do you counter that? And how do you teach children this idea when they go through these public school systems learning this all the time? So one thing he does at the Amos Wilson Institute, he had this huge, like this long rope. I mean, the rope was like 10 feet long. He like stretched his rope across. And what he did in that, he showed like how long African people have been in existence and all the different contributions and things Africans have had. But then at the same time, he would show the small instances of European intervention, like those small brief areas of Europeans colonizing us or oppressing us. And the whole point he was trying to show there is that they're just very small moments in our long history of being on the planet Earth. So that way we don't approach history as us always being victimized, always being oppressed. It changes our time orientation towards how we view ourselves within history. So that's one of the things he talked about, is like he institutionalizes some of these practices in working with the children.
So looking, conceptualizing beyond 19.
Yes. And he goes, of course, he starts with ancient Kemet and then comes up to the 21st century. And and I'm glad you brought it up, once you get to 1619, he shows how he's able to use that rope, right, that long trajectory of history and historiography to actually show the children that that's a small, brief period of our history and that we're much bigger and larger than that. And that way we don't think, like Amos Wilson says, when we internalize those spirits, one of those alien spirits begins to tell us that this is our natural state. And if this is our natural state, this is how we are, this is how it's always be, and this is our essence. And what he's able to do with working with these children at the Institute is show them that this is not our natural state, this is the aberration, and we can do something else other than that.
I'm glad you said that natural state. It brought to mind a question. I get a little bit of feedback on my side, but it brought to mind a question of the creation of the black criminal is a political necessity that maintains and perpetuates white supremacy. And we kind of moving away from that word white supremacy. We say white world terror domination, because that's again practice, right? That's the practice, and that's looking at the constant. So I don't know if you could speak a little bit about, you talked about creating that natural state, and Dr. Wilson's the black criminal is a political necessity in order to maintain and perpetuate white world terror domination. Could you, from your own personal experience in black psychology, could you speak a little bit about that and how Dr. Amos Wilson really personified that message in his writings and his lectures? And I'll come to Dr. Amos Wilson's lectures in a minute, but could you speak a little bit about that? And then we'll take some questions.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that Baba Amos does is that when we begin to talk about, even in the book Black on Black Crime, that he doesn't talk about black. I know we shy away from black on black, but I think he uses that term, but he doesn't really focus on like why we do this to ourselves. He focuses on what function does it serve. And I think that's one of the things that we always like about Amos Wilson. He says that regardless of whether something is true or false, what function does it serve? So when he talks about the black on black crime, he talks about how it's in the service of white domination. How crime is needed in order for this white supremacy or this white terror that you're talking about, in order for that to exist, black on black crime or black to black violence, that is needed. It's a necessity in order for white supremacy to maintain itself. So that's the first thing he begins to look at. Then also I like how he focuses on black self-hatred as a white defense mechanism. So in that, he's saying that what has happened is that it's socially constructed, and not the fact that it's not real, but in a benign sense that we're creatures who are socially constructed. So he talks about how they create through these social structures, create what he calls like this Frankenstein, right? You create this Frankenstein, or you create this monster that turns in on itself, this displaced aggression that turns in on itself. But what he does is flip it. We know what's created, but let's study who created the Frankenstein. And once we look at who created the Frankenstein, then we see what was the need for him to create this Frankenstein and what function does it serve. And it serves like to keep us from looking at who the real enemy is. So I love how he also connects back with Bobby Wright, and that Bobby Wright said that, like Alvin Toussaint wrote this book, Why Blacks Kill Blacks. And Bobby Wright said that black people kill black people because they've never been taught to kill white people. Right? And, I know it sounds so provocative, but in that, Amos Wilson picks that up and says that we've been trained to hate ourselves and trained to kill other black people, and so it serves that function within white domination.
Absolutely. Great point. So what I want to do, I know there's some questions. I know there has to be some questions because I can feel it. Let me go ahead and change the mode of the conversation to question and answer, and then hopefully. Okay, so if you have a question now, one or two ways you can do it. You can use the system to ask the question, and I'll see you with my cue, or you can just type it in the chat session and I'll read it out loud. But in order to answer your question correctly, I said we have a first question coming in from Althea. Oh, Althea went away. Let's see here. Okay, Sister Althea, you are unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, I was actually going to, that last statement about how black people haven't been trained, we may not have been trained to kill white people, but throughout our history, there's been rebellions where we felt we had no other option but to do that. So we had no problem doing what we had to do when there were, uprisings and rebellions. So we do understand, I guess, where we should be in the order of things, but I understand he's talking about us in general when he makes this statement. But just wanted to make that note that we have had moments of rebellion and still do to various degrees.
Sure. No, that's an excellent point. This whole history of, and I think that's part of when we talk about, when Amos Wilson talks about the falsification of African consciousness, when we talk about what Cam Howard does at the Amos Wilson Institute with how we approach our time and looking at history, if we look at that long historical trajectory, we're going to see moments, and not just moments, we're going to see that that's been our history, this idea of resistance. Whether it's, or Henry Holland Garnet, let our motto be resistance, whether it's the Maroons fighting back against enslavement, whether it's that has been a common mode, but in that falsification, we begin to look at those as anomalies, and it's unnatural instead of, no, that's part of what we do. We have resistance, and that's part of something that we've done historically. But the falsification makes it look as if it's an anomaly.
I had made a comment earlier when you were speaking about time. When I was at the shrine yesterday, they were actually talking about how time was changed once the Romans conquered ancient Kemet, to the point where they really changed how time was measured and began time when they took over, and they had a difference between BC and AD, marking the beginning of their rule, the Caucasian rule. So yeah, they really wanted to control everything.
And I think Bob and Amos with everything would ask us, in what function does that serve? What function does it serve for them to change the time? Because if it serves a particular function, then we can flip it and have our own time orientation, and then ask that same question, what function does that serve?
Right, and that's why things like a sidereal calendar is very important for us to understand how time is actually measured and make that connection that our ancestors, with our ancestors.
Right.
Yeah, and I think you hit on the great point about Dr. Amos Wilson is he's very consistent in his message is that, what function does it serve? And I think if from anything, at least from my own personal experience, I won't speak for everybody, but my own personal experience is if you ask that question daily to yourself, in the context of what Amos Wilson asks us to do. And I think Dr. Cress Wilson also talks about the areas of human activity. If you spend your money here, if you do this, if you ask yourself, what function does it serve? And then beyond that, who does it benefit at the end of the day? If you start looking at the beneficiary of these actions, it really paints a different picture, and you start clearing away, so to speak, the peel, start peeling away those layers of that alien spirit that goes into you.
So with that one, Kevin, a good example, I think, that one of those concrete, clear aspects of Amos Wilson's work is when he talks about how for every maladjustment in the African personality, there's an economic counterpart. So when he makes that connection, and that's something a lot of psychologists don't do, he makes that connection between our psychology and then there's an economic counterpart. So we talk about the function. So what function does it serve if we don't like our physical features? What function does being taught that internalizing culture misorientation and thinking that African features are negative? The economic component to that might be that, okay, I will spend money on changing my hair. I will spend money on trying to change my aesthetic characteristics to look like a European. So therefore, it's not just something idea that's abstract. There's a concrete manifestation of that based on how we've internalized this European worldview or internalized that alien spirit.
Sure, absolutely. Great point. And I think if you watch Dr. Wilson's speeches or lectures, I don't like to call them. Now, that's another thing too. Dr. Wilson will also always say that he considered his talks more so to be workshops than to be lecturing just for lecturing's sake. I would often see him at the I think it's the Slave Theater in New York, and he would say that he would actually write them out totally. All his speeches would be written out in full, word for word. And it was actually either a segue to a book he was writing or a project he was working on, but it was more so of an update of what's going on in his works and in his businesses from that aspect. I'm looking through.
Sorry, can I add on to that real quick?
Sure.
So another person I left out of the conference, which was a major aspect, was Sababu Plater. He was there at the conference. And he was the editor for most of Amos Wilson's books. And so he kind of gave us a background, a history into what went into Amos Wilson's thought process as far as publishing. And he was saying, like you were saying, how they would meet like in the subway, and he would just have all these writings of things that he had put down, and they would just like meet right there in the subway to talk about what book that would go in, what they need to edit, and then they were going about their business. But how he read the paper, read all these different books, and had all these ideas, and Baba Plater kind of helped like put it out there in the form that we see now. So that was another part of the conference that was good, seeing like what was some of the thinking and the process that went behind these publications that we see.
Great point.
So he gave a good insight.
I don't see any other questions. I'll let it go for a little bit longer in question and answer mode. We can stay in this mode right now. But so thank you. So moving, I'm looking at the paper that you submitted. Any other thoughts on the from theory to practice in terms of Amos Wilson? Maybe a little bit from your research in terms of what were some of those practices that he actually put in place. I know, and I don't know if you're familiar or not. I know he had businesses. I know he owned a building, I believe, in New York. I don't want to put this on record as being false. I might be wrong. But I believe he owned a building. I believe he owned at least a press. Are you familiar with any of the things that practically Dr. Amos Wilson had in terms of business-wise or maybe even schools?
No, the actual business in the schools, I wish I was. I'm not actually familiar with those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No problem. Okay. Looking at this here, I want to talk a little bit about just your work and how Dr. Amos Wilson, his theories, his practices, his writings, how has that kind of steered you in you said you went to Temple, you wanted to focus on psychology, black psychology. You could speak a little bit about in terms of, how these authors and these professors and these doctors influence your particular writings. I know you have some other writings we'll get to at the end. I saw a little bit more of your works, and I definitely want to speak to those a little bit. But in terms of what Amos Wilson directly influenced in your studies and in your works.
Okay, yeah. So particularly with Amos Wilson, I remember I worked at this bookstore in the D.C. area called Caribou, and we used to get these books in. And when we just go at FAMU, we just call different Amos Wilson books. We just do them by the color a lot of times. Like the black book, the green book, the blue book, the orange book, right? Yellow book. So when falsification came in, to me, that's kind of what inspired my work, because when Amos Wilson talked about psychohistory, and his definition of psychohistory is real plain, but I liked it. He said that psychohistory is the psychological result of having undergone certain historical experiences. So that was important for me because I always wanted to tie in psychology with history. And if we're like a amalgamation of all our historical experiences and what we actually experience in society, I wanted to look at what was the connection between psychology and history. And the way he talked about consciousness, this idea about the way we think influences behavior, that's what got me excited with doing this, some of my work. If I could I give you some of those quotes that kind of like early quotes that made me look at some of the things with Amos Wilson and some other work?
Absolutely.
Okay. So I like in Falsification when he says that even if we forget every fact in detail of inflated Eurocentric history, its intimidatory impression stays with us even when the content is lost. That's the point of it, to leave the impression, because that impression will become a dynamic source of behavioral orientation to the world. So here he's saying that it doesn't matter if something is true or false, but if we believe it to be true or believe it to be false, we'll act on that. So it doesn't have to be significant at the 0.05 level or anything like that. If we believe it to be true, it leaves that impression, then we'll act on that. So that's part of what I try to do in my work, is look at how history is tied into how we think, or at least how we approach history. So that's one aspect. The other aspect I like with Amos Wilson, I try to look at my work, is this idea of, he talked about social amnesia. And we can have social amnesia. And in class, I kind of take from Amos Wilson, he says that, what if you woke up in the morning and like forgot who you were? Like you didn't know your name, you didn't know how to tie your shoe, you didn't know who your wife, significant others were. As an individual, that type of amnesia is like a horrible state to be in. And what Amos Wilson says is that what happens if you take that and put that on a collective cultural group where socially and historically they forget who they are. So this idea of history playing into this amnesia and playing into how it shapes our consciousness was one of the things that inspired some of the work I do with Amos Wilson. Also, when Amos Wilson talks about contradictions and conflicts, we talk about, like, so Bobby Wright once said that the only contradiction among black people is that there are no contradictions. And Amos Wilson comes and hits on some of those same things, is that the reason there are contradictions, but we don't recognize them as such. And so once you recognize what the contradiction is, then you're able to try to move and find some type of solution to dealing with those. So I think that's some of the things that with Amos Wilson, that idea of consciousness, that made me look at some of the things in my work.
Okay. We actually have a question from Dr. Campbell. He typed it in the chat, and I'll go ahead and read it. What ways, other than economics, do you use to evaluate who benefits from a given phenomenon, i.e. primary, secondary, or tertiary benefits? What is the relationship between who originates something and who benefits? I'll restate those questions separately if you want me to.
Okay, yes, please do.
So the first one, what ways other than economic do you use to evaluate who benefits from a given phenomenon? That's the first question.
What ways other than economic?
Yeah, so in other words, what primary, secondary, what ways what are the evaluation ways that you use in terms of economics, other than economics, to determine who benefits? That's the first question. The second question, maybe you can ask that one first, is what is the relationship between who originates something and who benefits? And I know Dr. Campbell, he speaks about this a lot, determining the relationship between who originates something and who benefits.
Okay. I think I'm more equipped to deal some with the second one, and then if Bob Campbell wants to add on to it so I can get more centered into it.
Sure.
But what I'm thinking the relationship between who originates and who benefits is that the people who are the creators, the people who originate an idea or an institution, ideally, unless you have culture misorientation or unless you're not working out of your own group orientation, you're going to establish that for your own benefit. Like when Wade Noble says, power is the ability to define reality and have others accept that definition as if it were their own. So if I'm defining reality, or if I'm creating a particular idea or creating a particular institution, if I'm the creator of it, then I'm going to create it where it benefits me. So I think the relationship is that, the people who benefit from creating it are the benefactors. I don't know if that, but I think somewhere in there is where I think what I hear him saying.
Let me try to see if I can get Dr. Campbell on live. I don't know if he's
okay.
Good.
Dr. Campbell, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Okay, Bob.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I see as well. Recently, I gave a presentation, and we have some Marxists in the audience, and it really brought this up that if your daddy is a white man named Marx, he's injected his idea into you for his own self-preservation. And, really, we see that, play out where the person who calls himself after this white man is basically now the attack dog, So I definitely see that as a direct linkage that the intended beneficiaries are the ones who create the idea. I'm not going to have a dog to have it bite me. I have the dog in order to, do my bidding.
Right. And
go ahead. Right. And then the first one, I'm not sure if the question isn't clear, but usually that's the easiest one to point out, especially in terms of if you, like the economic side, that if you hate yourself, then you go and buy the bleaching cream, and then they obviously benefit financially from you doing that. You go and get something to look like a horse or a dog or anything other than a human hair, which is what African people have. So the economic one is usually the easiest one to show. The ones that are a little bit less, I don't know how to say it, not as easy to articulate are where Europeans benefit psychologically from something. So if they have a white Jesus on the wall and they see your black behind praying down to it, like they get a little psychological boost from that. Like some of these things in the area of health, in the area of psychology, in the area, so forth and so on. The economics I find are easiest to articulate. So I was wondering, do you have an evaluative criteria to explain who benefits in some of these other areas of human activity?
I'm thinking that I would have to sit down and actually try to line up what some of these particular things are, and I think if we had time, we could sit down and go through it. And I'll try to think of some. But what I'm thinking too is that even though the economic piece is easy, I think one of the reasons why I try to tie that in with Amos Wilson is that it's something concrete that people can point to and see that how it actually impacts our quality of life. So I think there are all those other ones that are there. But at the same time, I think that on one level it's easy, but I think he's also saying that this is something that you can show people where it actually impacts our quality of life, where it's not something abstract. So I guess I'm thinking with the white Jesus, what function does the white, Amos Wilson asks, what function does the white Jesus serve? But then when you can show how that white Jesus is tied into some behavioral manifestations, like say perhaps that because Jesus is white people are better, therefore I want to live near white people. Or I should go to school with white people. So that impacts whether or not we can have our own. Maybe that's part of the Bible too, that to the extent that I've internalized this European worldview and that the Europeans are superior, then maybe that's another one that's not totally economic. It can keep me from trying to do for self. When we think about Garvey and black nationalism and these different parts of us being autonomous and sovereign, maybe it can keep us from thinking we have the ability, the inherent natural ability to do for self if we internalize this European worldview. Is that somewhat tied in, Bob? Okay.
Yes, it does, to tie it into how it's concrete and how you can show it. So it seems like, what all the other areas that you can boil them down to some degree to the tangible economic, outcomes or, that are related to them. So, that does make it clear. It's kind of like a funnel, and at the bottom of the funnel eventually it's going to go to the economic side.
Right.
Absolutely. So, yeah, thank you. So, and like you said, and I think Amos Wilson, he was definitely clear on this point in terms of making that a primary message. And all his lectures, at least for me, I get from is that, we definitely have to start doing some serious identifications of things that impact us and who does it benefit in every aspect of our life. He definitely drove that home. And I remember there's a book. I don't know if it's a book, but I know Dr. Wilson speaks about this a little bit. Maybe you can expound upon this from your own experience, Dr. Jamison. The title of this book is Too Much Schooling, Too Little Education.
Right.
And I know that Dr. Wilson always gave us a definition, and Dr. Clark as well. I had Dr. Clark in my mind now, talked about truly what is education. What is education, and how should it serve us? Could you speak a little bit about that in terms of your understanding from Dr. Wilson's thesis or his theories in terms of education versus schooling.
Yeah, that too much schooling, too little education. That's a good one there. Yeah, that has a lot of actually in the piece I'm looking at with Asa Hilliard, I'm trying to tie some of that in. But yeah, particularly with Amos Wilson, I experienced that on a concrete level. Let's say I teach African American studies, and when students come around and you're trying to see like what their major should be, we have Black students who come through, and you should see how we have to like jump through hoops and flip to try to convince them that African American studies is something viable for them to study. And the part of that has to do with like Terry Kershaw talked about is that they don't see African people being worthy of study. And part of the reason they don't see African people being worthy of study is that they even being Black themselves, they question our humanity at times. But I think what happens there is that they're going into college looking at how do I get a job? I want to get a job. What type of job am I going to get? How is this African American studies? How is this study African history? How is that going to help me? And I think Amos Wilson, he hits it on here when he says that too many of us see education as essentially a preparation for jobs, moving up in social status and as a means of securing a better lifestyle. However, I do not see them as the primary function of education. I think it's vital that we understand that the major function of education is to help secure the survival of a people. And when we think about it in the context of the survival of a people, then that changes how we approach what education is and what the role of education is. So this idea of job, money, success versus survival. And then maybe even too, Kevin, maybe that's part of the remix, right? What does it mean to look at education in the 21st century for people of African descent when we don't think that our survival is at stake? You know what I mean? Like, so if we don't, like, when, say I'm talking to a student, we talk about survival. What do you mean survival, doc? We have all this technology. We have Black people in the middle class. So that type of critical consciousness is still understanding that our survival is at stake, and then tying it in that how do I use my education, whether it's informal or informal, how do I use education to try to equip the survival of our people? That's a different type of understanding.
Absolutely. You know, we talk a lot about, you just made me think of something. We talk a lot about, I know Dr. Campbell uses this analogy a lot. We talk a lot about turning the faucet off in terms of by the time a student gets to what they call higher education, in quotes, higher education, this student is so far alienated from who he is or who she is in terms of African identity that, you know, we oftentimes, educators spend a lot of time mopping up the floor. Mopping up the floor, so to speak, that, you know, they never really focus on turning off the faucet in terms of this miseducation or diseducation. But by the time they get to you, your job is just to kind of mop up the floor and try to get them back to even starting from square one. What are some of the challenges in your own African American Studies departments? What are some of your challenges? And I think Dr. Wilson spoke a little bit about this as well, as being challenged to truly educate children at a young age. I know I have the book African Genius for Children. About how do we go about educating our children? Homeschooling is one option. African Center schools is another option. What do you think in terms of if Dr. Wilson, from a Black psychologist perspective, what would be the takeaway in terms of how we should educate our children?
Yeah, I was reading over some things this weekend, and Amos Wilson talked about how a lot of times at the end of his talks, people would ask questions like, well, you know, what should we do, and how do we get out of this, and why do we do that? And I liked his response because his response was that sometimes he couldn't give just like a simple answer like this is it. He said that we didn't get in this mess overnight, and so therefore we're not going to get over it overnight. So his response was we have to train. And he said the training is not going to take place at a conference over the weekend. It just can't take place over 2 weeks. We have to like train every day, like train our children, train ourselves. We have to train every day. And so in that, I guess I think Amos Wilson would say that public education, we know that, I'm sure everybody listening knows that you can't expect those folks to educate our children the way we want them to educate our children. So, but at the same time, it can happen at the house. It could be the after-school programs, the rites of passage program, that we have to train within our own spaces and creating spaces, as Robert Williams says, these African-centered spaces, socialization spaces, as Dr. Kobe Campbell talked about. And so I think he would say that within the spaces that you can in class, you do that, But at the same day, it's going to end up being us having to do that for ourselves in some of these other spaces as well.
Mm.
And also, can I add on real quick, Kev?
Yeah, absolutely. The floor is yours.
In class,
we're here to listen to you, brother.
Amos Wilson talks about how, I like how he says that in class he likes to make his students uncomfortable.
Mm.
And that sometimes he's almost like in his pedagogy saying that he intentionally makes them uncomfortable. And intentionally making them uncomfortable, he's creating that type of tension. So you have to like have these ideas and these feelings, these emotions that like kind of conflict at times in order for you like to move past that uncomfortableness, to get to quote unquote the truth or this certain idea you're trying to get to. So I think that was part of his pedagogy too, that regardless of the space, we have to deal with those contradictions and bring up some of these uncomfortable ideas. And he even said that if you're sitting in the classroom and you're not uncomfortable at times, then he's not doing his job. So sometimes I think about in class, not that I want to be squirming all the time, but there's some issues we have to deal with that, yeah, you have to deal with that uncomfortableness to try to get past, to work our way through that if we're going to get to where we need to be.
And we have comments, the training has to start before anybody gets to them. Yeah, definitely, Sister everything. She said that essentially it's a race to the mind. Whoever gets to the mind first wins. Mm. So what are some of the techniques that you employ, particularly in your training of your students in terms of that uncomfortability in your classrooms? What if you can share, what are some of the things that you employ in terms of that speaking to that being uncomfortable in the classroom?
Yeah, so one of the things I do is that I try to make it where I bring up, I'm the facilitator, right? So I bring up the idea, but then by being able to them to work through it in groups. So what I do in class is that we have these things, which I got from actually from Jared Ball and from Brian Sims, who works for Jared. But this idea called Fight Club. And Fight Club is like this other way of dealing with debates. So instead of just having a formal debate where someone gets up and says an idea and another person says an idea, we take a controversial idea. Like say we take something like white Jesus. Mm-hmm. And we have people make 3 arguments for why white Jesus is, why we shouldn't have white Jesus, and then another argument why we should have white Jesus. And you let them ballot it out through this Fight Club. So what happens with the Fight Club is that they're able to deal with the uncomfortableness and the tensions, but they actually fight it out in the arena of ideas. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the ways. By having this Fight Club, they're able to actually like flesh out some of these ideas. And I tell them, it's when we talk about intellectual warfare, that's like one of the beginning stages of intellectual warfare. Within this cycle, we're a family, but we need to hone this idea out right here. So I put them in the Fight Club, let them fight it out, I facilitate, and then at the end, we try to come up with some type of synthesis after we work through it. So that's one technique that I've seen that's worked pretty good, is that already off the bat, we know that what we're about to throw on the board for the Fight Club is an uncomfortable idea for some people. It's something that people don't want to deal with, and we're going to fight it out with these ideas.
Sure. I want to take the time now to see if we have any other questions coming from the listeners. If you have any questions right now, feel free to chat it in the text box, or you can go live by question answer button, and I'll get you your phone unmuted. You can ask your question. In the meantime, I'm going to continue until a question comes in. A few of the titles of Amos Wilson. Hopefully we have one question coming in. Let me go ahead and go to that question. Let's see. We have a question coming in. Okay. Sister Althea, you're unmuted.
Okay. I understand, what Sister was saying, Sister Everything, saying that we have to educate our children before they get to the point of having to be schooled. But my goal is to reach kids whose parents are not doing that. And I don't know whether it's they feel uncomfortable because they don't have the information themselves, or they just don't know. There are, some of our people who just don't know. We didn't always have the knowledge ourselves. So I'm looking for a way to consider that. And recently I participated in a project with Dr. Renoko Rashidi and a group of researchers, and we produced a children's book. But trying to get that book in the hands of the right people is very difficult because, it's definitely going to circulate in the conscious community. It's our people who don't get this information that we're trying to reach. And that was part of my comment. How do we reach the public school system? I mean, all of these schools have Black History Month programs with resources allotted for that. But all you find is singing, dancing, drumming, which is not bad, but it's not educating the children on who we were before the Maya. It doesn't take us before slavery, back to the beginning of time. And that's what this book helps to introduce to young students in elementary level.
Sure, absolutely. Dr. Jamison, you respond to that?
I wonder if, and I'm not sure like the actual like nuts and bolts of how this goes, but I know Amos Wilson, towards the end of his life, he worked on these plays. And in these plays, he wanted to like bring forth some ideas of Marcus Garvey and Pan-Africanism. So I'm thinking that maybe like or even if you look at like what Ngugi did in Kenya, but this idea of like these community theaters. And so for us here, for Africans in the United States, I'm not sure if that would be through like our own community centers or even if we would use like churches or different programs as the means, but maybe like even that like plays or community type workshops. And he looked at even these community theaters that got for some of those ideas. But at the same time, it's not as if we're like ramming it down their throat. They see it and they live the experience by being able to interact with people in the actual theater and in the play. So I don't know, I was just thinking how I know towards the end of his life, Amos Wilson talked about making these plays that could kind of get some of these ideas out there for the community.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on a little bit about Dr. Amos Wilson and Marcus Garvey.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to know if you can expand a little bit more about that, the man himself and his Marcus Garvey and his approach to race first. I know he was a race first man, to use that term. Could you speak a little bit about Amos Wilson and Marcus Garvey and the influence, impact in his studies, and maybe even, I don't even know if in your own studies?
Yeah, so if you look at the African-centered consciousness versus the New World Order, the Green Book, he subtitles it Garveyism in the Age of Globalism.
Sure.
And in that piece, he tries to connect Garvey with some of the work that he's doing. And I see it as him trying to expand on Garvey and what is a concrete construction of Black nationalism. And that's the wording that Amos Wilson uses, that he saw Garvey as being a concrete construction of Black nationalism, where it wasn't just ideology, it wasn't just rhetoric, it was him building these institutions. And what I noticed when I looked at that over the weekend is that he said one of the things that Garvey, basic things he said was that we have to accept ourselves. And that if we don't accept ourselves, then that was like the first one. And I know that's basic for our crowd. But after he says we accept ourselves, then it's like by mandate, he says that Garveyism forces you to have to do for self. So accepting self and then doing for self. And I think that's where Amos Wilson ties in this idea of what does Black power mean? And almost like this relationship of as Black power increases, right, then the influence of white power on our lives decreases. So I think you see that with him as far as this do for self once we accept ourselves. And of course, the political and the economic, what were those the manifestations of that?
Right, absolutely. Yeah, so you mentioned a few titles. You said the Green Book.
Yeah.
You resulted back to the college days of the books. So I wanted to speak a little bit about a couple more titles just on the record and have you respond to those titles if you're familiar with them. The first one is, you talked a little bit about the falsification of African consciousness. I guess you would call that the Orange Book. Eurocentric history, psychiatry, and the politics of white supremacy, black on black violence. The psychodynamic of Black self-annihilation in service of white domination, and the blueprint for Black power. So the Black on Black violence, which is something that's still played up in today's media. You see a lot of this. A lot of times the narrative when we see situations on TV or so, It's always black on black violence. Even you see some of the people saying, well, what about we talk about we don't march in the streets for that. That kind of narrative comes out. What's from Dr. Amos Wilson in terms of his thoughts on black violence? Can you share with us?
Yeah, I think part of what we looked at earlier where he started being this idea of this displaced aggression. So in this displaced aggression, he ties in with this idea of who is taught to self-hate. So when Malcolm says, who taught you to hate yourself? Right? And so Amos Wilson ties in the context of let's take it off of just looking at us, but where did this self-hatred, and then when we see this manifestation of it in these killings, where does that come from? But also what I think he does, Kevin, which is interesting for me, is that he always flips the script on the narrative. So if I could read this one part, he talks about Colin Ferguson.
Mm-hmm.
So here he says, one of the things that frightened him most about the Colin Ferguson case was that Ferguson's self-hatred mechanism broke down. So Colin Ferguson was this guy, I think it was like late 80s, in the subway in New York, and he shot all these white people, right?
Yeah.
So he says, unlike many deaf, dumb, and blind Negroes, he knew who his enemies were. So when he got angry and hostile, instead of going out to drink himself to death, instead of going out to smoke crack and destroy himself, instead of going out to kill someone who looked like himself, instead of going out to commit suicide and put himself in a place to be destroyed by somebody else, he went directly to the source of his frustrations. This is what frightened these people. They were wondering how many more are there like that, and are their numbers increasing? And so for me, that was important because he looked at, okay, that what's the flip side of this black self-hatred? If it's a inverted hatred that really should be placed somewhere else, when Colin Ferguson acts out on this frustration of living in this underneath the dynamics of white supremacy, then all of a sudden he's in the wrong. So I think that part of what Amos Wilson does is he just throws this other angle on the social creation of the black criminal, what he's created for, and then what if that black self-hatred was turned in, let's say, another direction? What function would that serve, and how would that change how we view it and how it worked out in our lives?
Right. I think you just reminded me of another thought. And, like Amos Wilson always says, the constants. And when we see constantly throughout the history, when we, I don't know, lack of a better term, act in our right mind, either be a Nat Turner or a Bookman or a Dessalines or Manny, we see the reaction has constantly been one of fear. And I think Dr. Wilson always speaks about that fear aspect in the reaction to our right minds, so to speak, when we act those out. I think I had another question coming in. Dr. Campbell asked another question. What about black internationalism? In
the context of Amos Wilson?
I believe so. Dr. Campbell, if you're on mute, you can go ahead and ask your question. I'll unmute you right now. Yes, Dr. Campbell.
I think it's a little bit of feedback. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay, I'm thinking in terms of, when we look at Garvey, for example, and the red, black, and green is a flag for all black people, and I'm thinking, what if when Ghana got flag independence, instead of doing a separate flag, they made theirs red, black, and green? And then Togo did theirs as red, black, and green. Congo did theirs as red, black, and green. So all of these, fragments are one huge international black configuration, so bigger than a nation state. And what I've seen is a map that shows throughout the world all the places that black people are. So you see the Pacific Islands, Southern India, Australia, the continent, super-Saharan parts of the continent, Brazil, so forth and so on. So what I'm thinking about is this entire thing as one big black nation under the red, black, and green, this type of thing. So when we talk about black nationalism, that's in the terms of the size of a nation state that we're talking about. But I'm thinking about what about possibilities of black internationalism and then intranationalism. So if we're talking about this huge black super state, then, you know, the interactions that are going on within that super state, all under, again, the red, black, and green.
So, Dr. Jamison, that's the question. I don't know if you ever heard that question.
Oh yeah, I was able to hear it. Yeah, I think that ultimately that's like the goal, right? Because as long as, even if we look at, I like to look at Amos Wilson as, this is going to sound kind of wild, y'all, but almost like it's an African-centered response to Fanon. And I'm going to kind of try to tie this in with what Bob Kimball was talking about. But by saying he's an African-centered response to Fanon, there are certain points where you see Fanon critiquing nationalism. Like when he talks about the pitfalls and limitations, the weaknesses of nationalism. Mm-hmm. And in critiquing some of these weaknesses of nationalism, he critiques this idea of this monolithic, or the importance of culture, of cultural unity as the basis for these different nations coming together. And what I see Amos Wilson doing is that him critiquing culture and looking at that we make culture as we come along, but at the same time expanding beyond Fanon, and that he does see this all-encompassing, more diasporic type approach in the name of, like you said, this Garveyism race first. Because once you pull on the Garveyism and the race first, then the class, the nationalism, all those are consumed underneath of that. So yeah, I think that Amos Wilson would be more on for like the internationalism, this global Pan-Africanism, but particularly he would say, like, how does that manifest itself in the 21st century? Is that the same thing as a 15th century or pre-colonial African type of way of being? And I think Amos Wilson would say no, it's something that we'd have to construct according to our present contemporary reality.
Mm. Okay, I think we have another question from Sister Althea. I'll go ahead and unmute her real quick. Looks like I can't get Sister Althea on the call. Sister Althea, if you want to go ahead and type your question, I'll go ahead and relay that question. But yeah, so definitely in terms of Garvey, in terms of internationalism, we see the continuation of Dr. Amos Wilson's lectures and his speeches and his books, actually, you know, speaking directly to that theory in practice and in his lectures. Another title I wanted to talk about is, let me see here. We've talked about that one, The Psychology of the Black Child. So we talked about those titles. So what I want to do this last couple of minutes, if anyone has any questions,
can we hit on one? I want to make sure we get this one out before we go.
Okay, no problem.
I want to see, and then see if we can get some feedback from some people.
Sure, no problem.
Okay. So in the African-centered consciousness versus the New World Order, Garveyism and the Age of Globalism, one of the things I like about Amos Wilson is that when he talks about making people uncomfortable, I think that also applies to like African-centered Black nationalists, like to us as well. So in the end of the book, around 66, he talks about the true nationalists, and he calls it the restructuring of Garvey's legacy. And he goes in, and it seems to me that here he's like critiquing like us, like all these things that we need to consider as we move on. All right, so one thing he says is that the true nationalist is not obsessed with the past to the exclusion of the present. And I thought that was important because in other books he talked about, are we studying like ancient Egypt, ancient Kemet, these African civilizations? Are we studying these to try to prove that, you know, to escape? Well, one, he says, are we doing it to try to prove that we're just as good or just as human as white people? He calls it, is the way, we have to be careful that it's not a way of us going through the back door of some acceptance by white people. And so I love how like he's not scared like to throw that out there. And sometimes it even seems like Amos Wilson's the only one who can get away with this. Like if I just said this is DeReef Jamison, y'all be like, where'd y'all get this dude from, right? He's asking us like these hard questions about even ourselves. He says he wants to make sure that when we study this history and we study these things, that our heads aren't on backwards, he says, where we're not just, it's a way to escape from having to deal with our present reality. So he talks about how we need to be forward-looking and futuristic. So I thought that was a key point. And just a couple more with what I call his critique about African-centeredness.
Sure.
where's this other one?
Yeah, I recall the Dr. Wilson warning us. Why are you looking for the other one? Warning us against what he tells feel-good history.
Right.
Feel-good history. Don't get trapped in feeling good. Just feeling good about the history. What implications can we put in place today that we can deem for action? I think was his main thing. Study for action. Just feeling good. Yeah.
And then I wonder if I can throw this in, like, what does this mean for us? When Amos Wilson says the true nationalist is not afraid to overthrow tradition when tradition is unproductive. He is not one who just gives obeisance to African tradition out of some blind ignorance. He is one who says, even though I revere the African past and I revere the African traditions, that tradition can be built upon. I and my generation has something to add to that generation. I have a right then to use the legacy of that tradition to confront the realities of my current times and thus modify that tradition and see to the survival of my people. And I just wonder, like, what does that mean for us when you talk about overthrowing tradition when tradition is unproductive? And then also when he talked about I and my generation has something to add to that tradition. And I just love how he was critical enough to say we're African people, but what does this, to me I hear him saying, what does this 21st century African look, act, think, and do? And he throws that on the table. And I think that's like part of what we're trying to work out now in 2017. So I don't know, I really wanted to hear what people thought about Amos Wilson here and what he was saying.
So what I'll do in order to get the feedback, if you want to respond to that on the call, listening in, feel free to chime in by hitting the question and answer button. If you're on the phone, hit *6 and you'll be in my queue, or place it in the chat and I'll read your comments. For me, it says that our traditions and our culture is dynamic. In other words, it's not stagnant. It doesn't stand still. It is a dynamic thing, because I think what Amos Wilson says, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I believe he says culture is our way. Culture solves problems. Your culture should be the way to solve your problems. As we have different problems in the 21st century, of course, our culture has to adapt to resolve that problem. So in that way, it's not just, traditionally, it's also dynamically, how do we approach these different problems that we're facing today that we didn't face in the past. But I think to have that wherewithal within you to actually look within yourself in terms of culturally approaching those problems is a great start. But now, how do we keep making sure that we are in a place where we're not stuck in the past and we're not able to look forward in terms of problems? And like you said, study those constants in our history to know, like, if we did this in the past, for example, if we let, Eurasians into our space in the past, how did that work for us in the past?
Right.
Were we successful? Did we fail? Did it work? Did it didn't work? So how do we make sure we don't make those same problems? And I think what Amos Wilson wants us to do in terms of history and psychology is to learn from that history and not make the same mistakes, which, oftentimes, unfortunately, we find ourselves, from time to time, we do find people who do get lost in the past. That's just my input. I think we have some input coming in. Brother Ajamu, who's on the call, he says, the essence remains the same, to be enhanced to fit our changing conditions. We have another brother who chimed in, Baba Aja, who says, history can be studied, learn from our past mistakes, and using what worked, and not just to feel good about ourselves. Essentially, exactly what I was saying as well. And then sister who's on the line, Sister Everything, she says she's quoting actually Dr. John B. Clark. All history is a current event. And I know, you oftentimes saw Dr. Clark and Dr. Amos Wilson on the same panel, because it speaks to the fact that the psychologist and the historian, it's not that, you're over here, you're over there. No, it's a multifaceted approach to this situation. And the fact that Dr. Clark always said history is a clock. One of his famous quotes, history is a clock that people use to tell their time of day, where they are, what they should do, and what they should do in the future. I'm paraphrasing, of course. But and I think Dr. Wilson also speaks to that, but from a psychological standpoint, looking at those things over our past. What I want to do, Dr. Jamison, is to speak some about some of your other works. I looked on on the Journal of Pan-African Studies, of course. And then I saw some of your other work. So share with our audience some of the other things that you have published, submitted to journals, or that you're currently working on, or some of the projects. Because what we want to do on Habibi Tumi Council, we want to make this a place where scholars such as yourself, who have done that real work, have a place where we can be a community and a family to talk about different issues from time to time, on our site.
Okay. So yeah, my thesis, my master's thesis at Florida A&M was the relationship between cultural identity, rap music preference, and masculinity. And how I got to that as my thesis title, and it ended up being my first paper that was published, is that I used to be a rapper, so I was into hip hop, and then I was into black psychology and Baba Cambone with African self-consciousness. But I needed something that could how does this apply to something that we're actually dealing with? And that's when I ran across Amos Wilson, and he began talking about this reactionary masculinity. So us as black males, and how at times that in our efforts to try to live up to the standard of what a man is supposed to be, but still being blocked from some of those means of socially and economically and through structures of having to do that we create this reactionary masculinity. So within that, I looked at that tied in with rap music preference and whether or not cultural identity, or as Amos Wilson says, your consciousness or what type of spirit you have, how that could be a mediator as far as what music you listen to and what impact that has on you. So that one in particular was inspired by Amos Wilson, and I tried to tie that in with hip hop music and some other principles within black psychology. After I did that one, I began my other major areas, like I said, is the intellectual history of black psychology. So I've looked at Kobe Cambon, Naim Akbar, Amos Wilson. There's another piece, and I tried to compare African-centered psychology with what we call Fanonian psychology, because a lot of times people see those as being odd if they even put those even in the discussion with each other. So Fanon and African-centered psychology. And then recently, I've just sent out a paper on Bobby Wright. And Bobby Wright, when he talks about contradictions in this critical race consciousness, he's another prime example of this combination of race first being manifested through these black psychologists. So Bobby Wright, that's a recent paper. And then one that was just accepted with the Journal of Black Studies was one on Wade Nobles. And Nobles has, him and Naim Akbar, they reached back and looked at this concept called Saku. And when they looked at Saku out of ancient Kemet, they defined Saku as being the illumination of the human spirit, or that which inspires. And their argument is that through what they call transubstantiation, this mistake in meaning, that this study of the human spirit turns into the study of the human mind, and we get psychology from the Saku. So what I try to do in that piece is look at how he talked about Saku, but then how he worked that through his scholarship in these different areas. So Wade Nobles as someone who connects spirit with culture, with research, and trying to see how that works out as far as practice. So that's been some of the things I've tried to do in my work. Recently, what I want to do too is that, I learned from Amos Wilson in critiquing myself, and that sometimes my work is so dealing with these ideas and with the history that there's nothing concrete in the work. I might talk about, I'm critiquing myself, right? So I might talk about those who deal with liberation psychology, but where's my liberatory practice itself? So recently what I've been trying to work on is this paper where I want to compare and contrast here in Birmingham this whole history of the civil rights movement. And they talk about civil rights movement, these foot soldiers, but there's a lot of middle class respectability tied in with that, along with some grassroots organizing. So how that compares to this current reality that some of my students are dealing with, who are in Black Lives Matter and some of these organizations. And in the city, you see them at risk, this tradition of, it's Birmingham. We've had the civil rights. We've had Dr. King. We've had Shuttlesworth. We've had 50 years forward, right? That's what they celebrated in 2013. It's 50 years forward. And then there's this younger crew that's saying that, nah, it's not 50 years forward. It's either stagnant or it might have went back. So that's what the recent work I want to do. And in looking at that, I was looking at Amos Wilson again, and he talked about in the book with Garvey, how progress as an illusion. Mm-hmm. So here in Birmingham, this idea of 50 years forward implies that there's been all this progress. So when Amos Wilson says that progress as an illusion, that sometimes we assume that history just moves forward. If we dealt with that period, obviously things are getting better. And he says, now let's critically look at, have things improved in education? Have they improved in housing? Have they improved in all these other areas that impact our quality of life? So that's what I'm working out now in my mind as far as the method of how to do that, how these different groups are dealing with this idea of whether or not we've gone forward, whether or not we're stagnant, or actually, went back.
When the last piece you just mentioned, and thank you for that, I appreciate it, and we'll definitely be sure to stay abreast of your work and have you back. We welcome you to join Abibi Tumikasa, to share your work, to share your dialogue, and interact with the people on that forum. One of the things that you just brought to mind was what Dr. Amos Wilson would always say. Two things. In order for you to be, you had to be made to feel the freest. You have to be made to feel that you're the freest in order to be enslaved. In other words, you had to be free to, not free from. And he would always lecture on why are the things that you are free to do the most benefit somebody else. And when you think about, Dr. Amos Wilson and the things that he puts forward to us, and those little comments, those little perspectives, it makes you think about the situation. It goes back to what we talked about earlier about who benefits. So the thing that he would always say was, you're free to, not free from. And why are those things that you're freest to do? You can go and drink yourself into oblivion. You can go and do this and do that, but you think you're free. But you had to be made feel to be the freest in those situations in order for you to be what? Enslaved. And he would always say you can't be African and a slave at the same time. They both can't occupy the same space. So, Dr. Wilson for me is...
he's so clear, so clear.
You can have a 3-hour lecture in just one sentence.
Yes, indeed.
You can pause it. You can pause that one sentence and just have a mind...
And break that down,
right. So we're coming close to the end of the discussion, and I really appreciate the discussion thus far and your insights on Dr. Wilson and some of your own work. What I want to do is, before I do my little welcome to Abibi Tumikasa, I want to let you know that we do have a forum where you can come. We have a psychology forum, I believe, a spirituality, economics, where we discuss these topics on a daily basis. We have a lot of people who contribute to those forums on these very topics that we talked about today. And it's actually one of the things that we talked about in terms of self-actualization, self-determination, where we have our own site. We don't have to have these conversations in somebody else's house. Imagine, you want to talk about, doing something, but you're in somebody else's house. So you can't really speak too loud, so to speak. So we have our own house on the Abibi Tumikasa, and we invite you to come. We have a mobile app that you can download on your phone to stay interactive with us, because we definitely want to keep you involved in the community with your work and support your work and let you know that what you're doing out there is important to us. I know we talked previously about sometimes when you write, you write that and you submit, and when people read it, it really does impact on you in terms of your work.
Right.
So we definitely want to keep that vibe going. Any other comments I want to know right now from the people on the call? If you want to say, what I'll do right now, I don't know, I might shoot myself, but I'm going to open up the floor and unmute. Okay. So now everybody's unmuted right now, so it's like we're in the back of the house. So if anybody wants to chime in and talk to Dr. James, we have about 5 minutes left to say thank you, or you have comments or questions for Dr. James.
This is Ajit Kwaku. And I thank you, first of all. I thoroughly enjoyed this and got a lot out of it. Appreciate you giving us this time, and hopefully you'll join the site. Where can we read more of your work?
Great question.
Yeah, so most of the journals I publish in are the Journal of Black Studies, the Journal of African Studies, and the Western Journal of Black Studies.
Okay.
But
okay.
It's the Journal of Black Studies.
Okay.
The Journal of Pan-African Studies.
Okay.
And the Western Journal of Black Studies.
Okay. All righty.
And eventually, I want to try to, at least for the intellectual history piece, I want to try to put those together and end up being a book. So I have a couple more individual ones I have to work with, but then eventually I want to have those out as a book. And I definitely, I'm going to keep them posted, and I'm going to join y'all. I love this discussion. I really appreciate this space.
Absolutely. Appreciate you having me.
What did I say?
So we had a couple other people trying to say thank you for your time and joining us. They've enjoyed the discussion. And this is just a segue to the future, Dr. Jamison. We want to keep you in touch. And what I want to do is, I'll get with you after this, but in closing, and I'll let you have the last word, absolutely, we want to say that for us, at least, Dr. Amos Wilson, in terms of his theories and his practices and what he offered to us as a community, looking at his works and really thinking, doing what Dr. Jacob Carruthers calls that deep thought, in terms of how does this impact your thought. We want to continue this conversation. I think it's very, very necessary. So I'll close out, and Dr. Jamison, any last words?
Yeah, actually, I don't have too many. I really appreciate what you giving me this opportunity this morning to share these ideas. I appreciate the discussion, and really, I think you're like a manifestation in this space, and what y'all do is like a manifestation of what Amos Wilson, envisioned, right? This idea of being able to use our contemporary reality to address what's going on. So this is technology, but yet it's our own space where we work out our own ideas and come up with our own programs. Sure. So I just want to thank you for the opportunity and say y'all are definitely continuing in that Amos Wilsonian tradition.
Oh, absolutely. There's a term called Ubuntu. I am because you are, right? So we are because you are. So with that note, I'll close out and say thank you, everybody, for joining. And so this recording will be available. I will make it available to you, Dr. Jamison. So thank you, Dr. Jamison, for joining us.
All right, thank you too. Peace.
Thank you. Good
night.